The emotional complexity of the Bible continues to baffle me the more and more I read the scriptures. And in particular, the brilliant tension that we see in the scriptures that God holds, or he essentially marries, pain and hope together is quite radical. And I think it's breathtaking to see, especially when you see the whole breadth of Scripture. When you see from Genesis all the way to the book of Revelation, you see that as we encounter the Scriptures, we see our God weeping with people that weep. And not only that, we see a God that is charged with hope and promise for people to walk in promise. And he holds those tensions throughout the scriptures for us masterfully. And in the process, as he does this, neither pain nor hope are diminished. And yet, they're dignified. Our God is not like we'll say the non-God of Buddhism that says that suffering is a result of us craving things, and we just got to get rid of our cravings because suffering essentially is inherently evil. That's a philosophy that's out there. People believe that.
Yeah.
Moreover, there's also this notion that if we're good people, then we can't suffer, right? And that's wrong too, because it essentially eliminates the notion that you could suffer for reasons other than your own evil. And I love the story of Job because it embodies this tension. It holds it together so perfectly for people that need to hear the God incarnate who has both experienced pain and experienced, or is bringing hope. And Job is exquisite because what we see is in Job, he loses his children, his 10 children. He loses his whole entire wealth, right? Whether it gets sacked or whether there's some sort of weather situation destroying, the home or homes of his loved ones. And beyond that, to add injury to this pained heart, he gets struck with boils and is essentially got a plague upon him. And so people don't want to touch him, they don't want to come near him, and he's just essentially drinking his own tears. And even though Job loses all of this for no fault of his own, he suffers these things for no fault of his own, God lets him grieve out loud. And he processes the pain, and that's essentially what the book of Job is God giving space to say, it's okay to grieve. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to feel pain. And what we get in touch with here is God's emotional intelligence through the book of Job. And grieving is a messy, imperfect, imprecise, non-linear process. It doesn't follow a pattern that we would like it to. And yet God graciously allows us to go through it without either condemning us or correcting us immediately in the process. Some of you know I love the Harry Potter series. I love the books. Hate the movies, love the books. Movies are terrible. We can debate that. But the Harry Potter, in so many ways, captures grief in ways that I think help us to find some pathways to maybe even understanding Job. Harry Potter, as a character, is a boy who lost his parents because of an evil lord killing his parents. And so he grew up as an orphan. And he got, his aunt and uncle who are not very kind and not very nurturing to him, raise him. And by the age of 10, he's become kind of an outsider in his world, an outsider in his family, and then he gets a letter out of nowhere that he's going to be going to wizarding school, and he's a wizard, and he doesn't realize this. And after building relationships and learning and going through so many adventures for 5 years, he begins to learn that he has a godfather, and his godfather was like best friends with his father. And unfortunately, in book 5, which is the Order of the Phoenix, he loses, spoiler alert, sorry, he loses his godfather. And the book ends essentially with Harry in Dumbledore's office. Dumbledore is this unbelievable wizard who's essentially guiding Harry and trying to protect Harry. And he loves Harry. And he's helping to vanquish the evil Lord, Voldemort. And yet he could not help Sirius Black from dying. And the scene at the end of the movie, the book, essentially is this process where Harry's in there with Dumbledore just after he lost his godfather, who was like a father to him. And Harry cannot be consoled. And imagine in J.K. Rowling's wizarding world here that Harry experiences all of the phases of grieving that we're going to talk about this morning. He goes through them all. He is in denial. He's in shock. He's numb. Then he's angry and frustrated. And then he starts thinking, it's my fault. I should have done something. And then he's extremely sad. And then there's times where he actually gets it and he's starting to see the light. And this all happens in a conversation with Dumbledore that goes all through the night. And part of this process, and the amazing character of Dumbledore as a written character in J.K. Rowling's mind, is that Dumbledore allows Harry to process. And in the process, Harry gets all of these emotions out, and even part of that is in saying horrific things to Dumbledore. And he's even able to throw all these incredible valuables in Dumbledore's office. He starts trashing the office. And Dumbledore is unfazed by this. And he just allows Harry the space to grieve. And Harry thinking, you have no idea, you can't understand. He's inconsolable because what he doesn't realize is that Dumbledore has his own pain and has his own grief and has been in his spot in many ways. And so you know what he does? He allows Harry the space to grieve. And I feel like Job is like essentially God allowing Job to trash the office. He's going to kick over all sorts of stuff. He's going to say all sorts of things. You don't get it. You don't understand. I wish I could see God to his face. And not only is he getting angry with his friends, he's going through this process. And this is what grieving is like. It's messy. It's imperfect. It's non-linear. And what we're going to look at this morning is this notion that God graciously allows us to grieve when we suffer loss. And we may even call that trauma. It's another word for loss in many ways. And there are several elements to processing grief that we're going to explore this morning. And through Job's experience, we're going to look at the 5 traditional kind of, we'll say, if you want to say stages or phases of grieving. And we're going to dive right in and start to feel some of this grieving, and you may need to hear this because you right now are grieving. And there are some times where grieving gets delayed because we don't give ourselves process, right? And yet there's an invitation for us here. I love our God. I love what the scriptures are for us. And Job is an invitation to say, to feel pain is to be human. To feel hurt is to have a heart. And yet, God is with us. Yes. Yet God is with us. through Job's experiences, we're going to look at this. And so the first really phase or stage that we talk about in traditionally when we are grieving is this element of denial. And when we're in denial, we're really asking the question, is this real? I remember when I heard news when I was younger that my grandfather had passed away. And I was just like, Papa? Yeah. It crushed me. Yeah. But it took time to I couldn't even process. And my parents had to help me with this whole denial thing, because you start to go, is this even real? Is this a dream that I'm having? It's surreal. You're almost levitated from this. And we get this right in chapter 2. After Job's friends arrived to comfort him, they were in silence for 7 days following the realities, right? And what's happening is these realities are going to settle in. And they're going to just sit there for a while. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all of this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They had made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. And you can imagine he is numb right now. Yeah. You mean I lost all of my children? That's the biggest part, right? I'm sure Job would tell you, you could take everything else but my kids, right? So the world that he now has, and then on top of this, he's sitting here, he can't even really hug people probably, because he's got boils, right? And now people are going to start distancing themselves from him. So now he's repulsive. It's a lot to wrap your head around here, right? And here, for 7 days, there's just crickets. I bet you they weren't eating. Maybe had some water now and again. Doesn't say they were fasting, but I imagine hard when you're sick to your stomach and you can't even bring yourself to put a morsel in. And it's common when we are hit with tragedy or tragic news to feel numb and shock is a lot of what we talk about when we're doing this. And what's happening is that our hearts are now catching up to the realities that we just have experienced. The journey is being made in our hearts. And it is natural to feel the discomfort of trauma. Now you're uncomfortable. And there's a process to go, okay, I don't want to be uncomfortable. I think that's part of what denial is all about, is that we want a different reality here. And extreme forms of denial can lead to self-deception, even delusions. And it's incredible. This happens a lot in people who have suffered from PTSD in war, particularly. They suffer from delusions, and dreams start to replay themselves and the horrors of the things. And all of a sudden, they have to just quelch it. They don't talk about it. They don't say anything, right? And this can happen to us. Because what's happening is we're actually bypassing the process, or the way in which our hearts actually function. And we can delay our grieving that way. But denial is asking the question, is this real? And then, second, comes the anger and rage. Because when these things happen to us, now the question is, was this right to happen? Is this right? Is this just? Is this supposed to happen? And when the answer is no, what happens? This is where our anger comes from, our rage comes from. And it is rare that we would see pain in our lives and think anything short of the notion that this is an injustice. That's rare not to think that. And it can cause us to get quite angry, even to the point where we feel like we're being attacked. We can project sometimes that, right? We want to tell ourselves some stories sometimes. But this is a legitimate thing that we have to consider. Is this right? And our anger can be the result. Job was angry. He was angry with the friends that he had, the counsel that they gave. He called them miserable counselors. You guys are giving me foolishness, right? And he started even being sarcastic with them after a point. Oh, thank you. These wonderful words, you know. And moreover, the biggest anger he felt was toward God. In Job 16, he says, if I speak, my pain is not assuaged. And if I forbear, how much of it leaves me? Surely now God has worn me out. He has made desolate all my company, and he has shriveled me up, which is a witness against me. And my leanness has risen up against me. It testifies to my face. He has torn me in his wrath and hated me. He has gnashed his teeth at me. My adversary sharpens his eyes against me. You ever felt that?
Yep.
You ever felt that? How is he feeling about God right now? How is he looking at God? It's okay, I want to hear what you think. How is he responding to God right now?
God's his enemy.
Right.
God's trying to take him down.
Right. Right? Yeah, bro.
God's kind of a jerk.
Yeah, he's got a sense of humor, that's for sure.
Right. This is it, right?
God's the kid with the magnifying glass on the
Right,
ants.
on the ants, right, exactly. This, there's more he'll say. Chapter 21, he says, why do the wicked live, reach old age, and grow mighty in power? Their offspring are established in their presence, and their descendants before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, and no rod of God is upon them. What's happened here?
Being tested.
Well, that's true, but what's he processing here? What's he saying about God right here?
It's unfair.
He's saying God is being unfair. So much so what? What does this mean?
He's letting the wicked prosper.
Yes! Exactly. The wicked must prosper. And what's happened is that when there's a intersection we get to when we're at anger. And at this intersection, there's really a long, dark road that leads to cynicism. And this is on the path. This is part of this crossroads that we're at here. Is going, God, you are unjust. Right? And the Lord just goes, you're allowed to think that. You're allowed to say that about me. Right? Chapter 30. God has what? Cast me into the mire. Let's read this together. God has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry to you for help, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you only look at me. You have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand, you persecute me. This is heavy, right? That we think God is now our enemy and is against us. You are cruel to me. So what's being felt here is injustice. Injustice. This isn't right. This isn't right. And what can happen at this intersection is that if we hang here too long or we hang a wrong turn at this intersection, this can lead us down a road that's going to lead to bitterness. This can lead us down a road that's going to lead to hatred. And this is going to lead us down a road that could even lead us to violence. And at least a level of cynicism and negativity that is hard to escape from. And when we are feeling this raw pain, it's very tempting to take it personally. But the Lord allows us to feel pain. And this is part of what this can look like. third reaction and response we can have when it comes to our grieving and our suffering is bargaining. And I don't mean bartering for a better price on a car. Bargaining is really asking the question, am I responsible for the trauma that I'm experiencing? This is almost the pendulum swing from anger. This is the beginning of this pendulum swing, because now you're going, wait a second, it's not their fault, it's my fault. And because you're going through all the options to assign blame now. And here you say, I'm responsible. And with Job actually kind of starts here a little bit. And he works his way towards some other things, but he starts here, right? Job, he considers blaming himself early on, but upon further reflection, he's convinced that he's not the one. But he says here, Job 7, right? How long will you not look away from me, nor leave me alone till I swallow my spit? If I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden to you? Why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I shall lie in the earth. You will seek me, but I shall not be. So part of this, right? You see this in verse 21. He's even considering that he's committed some sin that he's not being pardoned for. He's not being forgiven for. But yet he continues, right? Chapter 9. Chapter 9. If it is a contest of strength, behold, he is mighty, thinking about God. If it is a matter of justice, who can summon him? Though I am in the right, my mouth would condemn me. Though I am blameless, he would prove me perverse. I am blameless. I regard not myself. I loathe my life. So Job doesn't linger here when it comes to bargaining. That's probably a good thing. He doesn't sit here and blame himself. And why is that important? How does the book start off with? What's God say about Job?
He's blameless.
Right. He's blameless. So Job is actually agreeing with God here to an extent. But we see it's messy, isn't it? Very messy. And even twisted a little bit here, because now he's essentially putting the responsibility on God. So he doesn't linger here, but some of us, especially those of us who are prone to what is called navel gazing, right? This is your navel, and you just kind of look down at yourself all the time, right? Those of us who are sensitive, those of us who maybe are a little introspective, we can hang out here big time. We can hang out here big time, right? And remember, I don't know if you've seen the movie Good Will Hunting, but there's a famous scene that kind of cracks the nut of this movie with the main character, right? And he's essentially in a therapy office with Sean, right? Will is. And what's he have to be told? It was the famous line that Robin Williams has to say to Matt Damon, right? It's not your fault. It's not your fault, right? Sometimes we can linger here. And that's the whole point of the book of Job, is that Job, this isn't his fault. This isn't his fault. And I have found that taking inventory and finding things in the midst of all these things to be grateful for is really, really helpful in moving through this. That we don't linger here and think, what, I should have done something better. Fourth. Actually, no. Let's go back. I missed one here. Just so we get it. Again, Job saying, I hold fast my righteousness, and I will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. Again, just to punctuate that he's not lingering here. So let's continue. Number 4, suppression. And I think depression is not just being sad. This is a long season, sometimes for many, of actually sinking into the mire of pessimism. Because you're asking the question, will this ever change? This is now my lot in life. Will any good ever come now? And as we look at all the options of what can happen, and this is really, again, part of this pendulum swing, you go from this anger and rage to like, it's somebody's fault, to it's my fault. Now you're going like, who's to blame, but it doesn't even matter. I have no control over anything. Right? Will this ever change? Grieving our losses can make us feel incredibly lonely, incredibly isolated, and helpless because we don't think anything's going to change positively. And I just want to just sit here for a second and say, this is a huge part of the problem that we face in New England, particularly in New Hampshire and southern New Hampshire. We've talked about this countless times. Isolated independence is kind of a core idol for us here, right? We move away from each other and move towards self-reliance, right? Where this is part of the attractiveness of being rural in New Hampshire, right? Let's move away from people.
Live off the grid.
That's right, let's live off the grid. I don't want to depend on anybody because all anybody does is hurt me. Right? We love trees.
Talk about the utilities.
But that's a part of it. That's a spiritual, that's a physical part of the spiritual reality. Right. And a lot of times we want to live spiritually off grid as well. Right?
Yeah.
And this is an epidemic for us here. And I think a lot of this is because we have a depressive mindset, and there's a lot of losses we've had, a grieving that has yet to be pushed through and moved through. Job 3, Job starts this way, right? After sitting there for 7 days with his friends, being able to essentially say nothing but cry, the first words out of his mouth are his anguish. Let's read this together here. Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Job comes, his first words are expressions of his depressed heart, right? And this is the kind of anguish that grief can bring. It will take a physical toll on us. We feel physical symptoms about this. Remember in the Psalms, David talks about his bones aching, right? And his groaning all of the night. And Job is feeling the exact same things through his own loss. We get that, and he continues in Job 3. For my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. I love how the Lord just allows us to feel this. He just goes, yep. That's what it feels like. Essentially, my bread is my sighing. That's what I'm feasting on. Job 10. He's to the point of despair where he just like, why am I alive? Why am I even alive? Why do you bring me out from the? Why did you bring me out from the womb? Would that I had died before an eye had seen me, and were as though I had not been carried from the womb to the grave. Are not my days few? Then cease and leave me alone, that I may find a little cheer before I go. And I shall not return to the land of to the land of darkness and deep shadow, the land of gloom like thick darkness, like deep shadow without any order, where light is as thick darkness. And when we live here, this can be probably the lowest point that we can get to when we start to really consider where the bottom is. That's what's happening. This is part of bottoming. and left on, thinking about long-term pessimism can turn us into not necessarily angry, but really, really emotionally unavailable people for others. And so this is probably the most heart-wrenching because it takes the most energy, in my opinion, that I've seen. And it's really, you get to the point where he's inconsolable. And that's where silence is helpful. And presence is really, really helpful. And his friends weren't good they jumped right on, as he's talking about his anguish, they jumped on him immediately. So not good for them. And if bargaining is trying to gain control of the story, trying to gain some sort of narrative here, then depression can be the opposite. No difference can be made. This will never improve. And then fifthly is what's referred to as acceptance. And others have even talked about resilience as a way of thinking about this. And I don't like to think of acceptance as a final phase, but it's essentially asking the question, so what is in the future here? What's the future looking like now? Because quickly, and this happens, I remember just talking to Dan Castine. Dan Castine right now, he may be in the process of losing his father. He doesn't know. He just lost his brother a few months back. And one of the observations that Dan made, and I've heard many, many echo this, is like when you're grieving and you start to kind of gain some clarity, you start to realize that the world hasn't stopped. It's hard that the world hasn't stopped. Hasn't slowed down to be like, oh, I'm sorry, were you hurting? Oh, we're going to shut down the stock market. Okay, we're going to take a holiday here because you're sad. Okay, everyone. Holiday. Everyone shut it down. No work, no nothing. We're just going to come, wouldn't we love that? But you start to realize we're in a very big world and we're not the only ones, right? And the world continues to turn. And I don't think that acceptance is a final phase, because acceptance is cyclical. All of these phases are cyclical. They're not stages that you get to and it's linear. I go from denial to anger. Now I'm angry. Okay, how long am I going to be here? Okay, now I'm bargaining. It's my fault. How long am I going to say this? Then I'm going to be depressed. Okay, how long am I going to be depressed? Can't wait to be in acceptance, and here we go. Mamba, we're here. We made it. I wish it happened that way. But it doesn't, does it? No. We move in and out of this. We move in and out of these phases. And what's interesting is Job seems to accept loss early on, doesn't he? His first replies are fascinating. He says, right, after the news of losing his family, right, and losing all of his possessions before he gets struck by a plague, was this: naked I came from my mother's womb. Let's say this together. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Wow. What a statement. Right? The Lord will punctuate this and say, and in all his saying, Job did not what? Sin. You just went, what? It seems like he got it. Like he didn't have to grieve. And he's showing flashes of acceptance that's here, right? He continues in chapter 2. Let's read this together. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? And in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Wow. That seems like he's accepted. Hey, guess what? This is the beginning. This is the beginning. And then his friends show up, and then denial, starts to kick in, right? And then all the other phases have their play, but it doesn't mean that these are wrong. Matter of fact, he's saying all the right things right here, right? This is a godly reply in so many ways. But this isn't going to be the final state, right? This is mingled with other things. It's mingled together. So much so that there's going to be other glimpses of his acceptance throughout his story, throughout his talking. Particularly, Job 13, a famous verse. Many of you have this memorized. Let's say it together. Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Yet I will argue my ways to his face. Interesting, isn't it? What's happening here? What are some of the dynamics? Right? Though he's speaking of God, though he slay me or hurt me, I will still hope in him. He can still have a positive outlook on the future, right? And yet it's mixed. What's it mixed with? Yet I will argue my ways. Yet I'm angry.
It seems like that, like in the beginning, he might have been still in denial.
Yeah.
Because the emotional weight hasn't
Yes.
dropped
Yeah.
yet. Like
Right.
he hadn't fully come to terms with, oh, this is all real. This is
Yes.
just like a really bad dream.
Right.
So I can be the good person and say all the right things. and get some good points.
That's right. And then all of a sudden, the catch-up happens, right? And boom, all of a sudden, right. And this is part of the messiness of grieving, right? Job 19, let's read this together. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. Wow. He's calling God his Redeemer. That's a good thing. That's a positive thing. He's saying, the Lord redeems me, and he knows that in the end, right, what's the future going to look like? I'm going to be face to face with him. He's going to be here. So there's actually some faith that's here. But again, mixed and mingled, imperfect, right, in these statements. And acceptance is never really complete, but I think this is just how we start taking steps, or next steps in our journey. And it's where we can start, where I think feeling movement, feeling some movement. A lot of times we feel stuck when we're grieving. And I think part of acceptance is there's this kind of like glimmers, there's glimmers, and you start to go, okay, let's just take one step at a time. I don't have it all figured out. I don't know what the answers are. I know there's meaning here, but I don't have it. But I can essentially take my next steps, right? And I think it's very important too for those of us who have lost loved ones here. Moving on does not equal getting over. Moving on does not mean getting over, because when you truly love, you really don't get over. You don't get over the loss of your father or your mother or your siblings or your children. You don't get over that. But you can take next steps. That's a very, very important distinction, because guess what? You have permission by God to feel that loss and to be sad and to feel the pain. And God gives us, he allows us in his grace to grieve the suffering of loss, because God himself is experiencing ongoing grief. Our God is a God of grief.
Yes.
In fact, we are told about Jesus that he was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. God became one of us and entered in to all of the experiences of physical pain and emotional loss that attach him to us. He's gone in all the way with us. In Hebrews 5, we read about Jesus' grief as he's looking at the pain he's about to encounter. as he looks at the cross and he looks at dying for the sins of the world, as he looks at the unjust suffering that he's about to engage in, and the being betrayed by friends and being given up. And here it is. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. It's one of the most important chunks of Scripture. These verses are so helpful to us, to understanding the God of grief. And he grieves. Why? Because he knows what unjust suffering is going to be. He knows the temptation even to be in denial, right? What happened to Jesus in the garden? Do you remember what happened to Jesus the night he was betrayed? And he was praying, right? One of the elements that happened to him is he knew the trauma that he was going to face. And he was already starting to grieve that. And his blood became, or his sweat became blood. He started to bleed out of his pores, which is an extreme rare condition that happens in the most unbelievable stressful situations. And the weight was coming upon him. The weight was coming upon him. And what did he do? He cried. He cried. He says, Lord, rescue me. Lord, may there be another way. And then what does he say? Right? That's almost like a denial of kinds, but he doesn't live there. He's just like, but not my will, but yours be done. Right? King David, 2,000 years ago, 1000 BC, king over Israel, right? A beloved, the man after God's own heart. David wrote half the Psalms that we have, right? Biggest book in your Bible is the book of Psalms. David wrote half of that. And he was a poet. And he wrote songs. And he actually understood what it was to comfort people in distress, because he did that to King Saul, the one who he would succeed. And David was given permission. God allowed him to cry. Most of David's Psalms have a twinge of absolute agony. Psalm 22 is one of them. Psalm 22. What does he say? As he's being persecuted, David was being persecuted by Saul, the guy he was going to succeed. He loved Saul, he loved Jonathan, and he's being betrayed by him. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Sounds like Job, doesn't it? Right? Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. What's incredible is you see David going through all those phases of grief all in a few verses, don't you? You see the sadness, you see the anger, you see a little. You don't really see the bargaining, but you see this whole element of going, Lord, what's going on? You got this? You on my side? And then there's twinges of acceptance here. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. These are the words of somebody who's going through grief and pain and trauma. Yet, our God of grief can claim these words for himself. That's what happened on the cross. Jesus on the cross said in Mark 15, what? Something similar, didn't he? Jesus, as he's on the cross, as he's suffering judgment in our place, right? As he's experiencing God turning his back on him for us because he became sin, who knew no sin. The righteous one suffering in our place. When the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is the Aramaic, right? Which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? God knows what it's like to feel abandoned by God. This is what God is inviting us into, is that he's a grieving God and he's going to grieve with us even. I'm telling you, this is our God. The prophet Isaiah gave us a window into this, and we're going to close by, I'm just going to be reading this for us so we can hear the grief of redemption for us. In Isaiah 53, I'm going to leave that there, but I'm actually going to read all of chapter 3. If Isaiah 53 is not worn out in your Bible, maybe it's time to take another look. Maybe it's time to revisit. Because this is God foreseeing his grief in Christ. Isaiah 53 starts out, "Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people? And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors." Let's pray. Let's pray and ask the Lord to help us as we consider his grace in allowing us to grieve.